The third letter arrived with a bright orange sticker that read, "Property line warning." 72-year-old Walter Green stood frozen at the edge of his porch while dozens of hungry birds circled above his yard. The HOA claimed he was destroying neighborhood property values. His crime? Feeding birds every morning. At first, Walter thought the letters were ridiculous. Then someone smashed his bird feeders in the middle of the night. Then neighbors started whispering when he walked outside. Then the HOA president threatened to take his home. But the worst part came 3 days later, when Walter discovered who had secretly been reporting him the entire time, and by the end of the month, the entire neighborhood would turn against the HOA in a way nobody saw coming. Walter Green woke up every morning at exactly 6:15. Not because he wanted to, because after 43 years of factory work, his body no longer knew how to sleep late. Even retirement hadn't changed that. Neither had grief. Every morning, sunlight crept through the thin kitchen curtains while the old coffee machine rattled loudly on the counter. Walter would pour himself half a cup, stare at the empty chair across from him for a few seconds, then quietly look away. Helen used to sit there. 3 years had passed since cancer took her, but Walter still couldn't bring himself to move her favourite chair. Some mornings he caught himself listening for her footsteps anyway. The silence afterward always hurt. That was why the birds mattered so much. At 6:30 every morning, Walter stepped onto his front porch, carrying an old red coffee tin filled with birdseed. And almost instantly, they appeared. First the sparrows, then the cardinals, then blue jays screaming loudly from nearby trees. By 6:35, his yard came alive with fluttering wings and tiny chirping sounds that filled the quiet neighborhood air. Helen loved that sound, especially the cardinals. She used to believe cardinals carried messages from loved ones who passed away. Walter never really believed things like that. But after she died, the birds became the closest thing he had left to company. So every morning he fed them, and every morning, for a little while, the house didn't feel so empty, until the letters started arriving. The first one came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Walter almost threw it away without opening it. Most HOA mail was nonsense anyway. Reminder notices, lawn maintenance updates, holiday decoration deadlines, but this envelope was different. Bright white, red lettering. Official violation notice. Walter adjusted his glasses slowly. Then he read the sentence twice. You are hereby notified that feeding wildlife constitutes a violation of community sanitation standards. Walter blinked. Wildlife? He looked out the kitchen window. 3 sparrows hopped harmlessly near the feeder. 1 tiny cardinal perched on the fence. This has got to be a joke, he muttered. The letter warned him to immediately remove all feeders and discontinue wildlife attraction activities. Failure to comply would result in a $100 fine. Walter actually laughed, then tossed the letter onto the counter. Problem solved. Or so he thought. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This time the fine was $200. Walter frowned deeply while reading it. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Previous warning ignored. Something about that sentence bothered him, not because of the fine, because of the tone. It felt personal. Walter walked outside carrying the letter. Across the street, curtains shifted slightly inside one of the homes. Someone had been watching him. He suddenly became aware of how quiet the neighborhood felt. Too quiet. Maple Glen always looked perfect from the outside. Clean sidewalks, perfect lawns. Matching fences, but people rarely talked to each other anymore. Most communication happened through complaint emails and HOA notices. Walter never paid much attention before. Now he started noticing everything. The woman 2 houses down who stopped watering flowers the second someone walked past. The teenager who hurriedly moved his bicycle after receiving a parking warning. The old couple who removed their porch swing after HOA complaints. Everyone seemed nervous all the time, and suddenly, Walter was nervous too. That evening, Walter sat, alone in his living room, staring at the second violation notice. $200. That mattered. His retirement income barely covered groceries and medication already. Helen's medical treatments had destroyed most of their savings years ago. He picked up the framed photo sitting beside the lamp. Helen smiled brightly from inside the picture, while holding a tiny red cardinal figurine she once bought at a craft fair. You'd think they'd have bigger problems, Walter muttered softly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Walter looked toward the dark backyard, then slowly stood up. 5 minutes later, he stepped outside wearing an old jacket and carrying fresh birdseed. The birds landed before he even reached the feeder. Walter smiled faintly. I'm not abandoning you guys. Across the street, a phone camera snapped a picture Walter never noticed. The third letter arrived Monday morning. This time, the fine was $400. Walter's stomach dropped immediately. At the bottom of the page was a sentence that made his chest tighten. Continued violations may result in legal action and property liens. Walter sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Property liens. They were threatening his house now, over birds. For the first time, fear started replacing anger. He imagined lawyers, courtrooms, bills he couldn't pay. What if they actually could take his house? His hands shook slightly while rereading the notice. Then suddenly, bang! Walter jumped violently. Something hit the front window. He hurried outside. A rotten orange rolled across the porch. Teenage laughter echoed from farther down the street before disappearing. Walter stood there silently holding the violation letter while birdseed scattered around his shoes. Someone in the neighbourhood wanted him gone, and things were getting worse. The monthly HOA meeting took place Thursday night inside the Maple Glen clubhouse. Walter almost didn't go, but fear finally outweighed discomfort. He entered quietly while residents filled metal folding chairs beneath bright fluorescent lights. At the front sat Cynthia Holloway, HOA president, late 50s, blonde hair cut perfectly sharp, white blazer without a wrinkle anywhere. She looked like someone who corrected grammar during funerals. Walter had lived in Maple Glen nearly 20 years, and somehow Cynthia had made the neighbourhood feel colder within only 3. Walter took a seat near the back. The meeting dragged endlessly through landscaping budgets and trash can regulations until finally Cynthia asked, "Any resident concerns?" Walter slowly stood. The room immediately became uncomfortable. People recognised him now. Birdman. Walter cleared his throat. "I'd like to discuss these fines I've been receiving." Cynthia didn't smile. "The wildlife violations?" "They're birds," Walter replied calmly. Cynthia folded her hands. "Several residents have complained about sanitation concerns and excessive animal activity." Walter frowned. "I've fed these birds for almost 10 years. The board recently reviewed the matter. Walter noticed something strange. Nobody looked at him. Not one person. They stared at tables, papers, coffee cups, ashamed, afraid. Walter suddenly understood. People weren't just scared of Cynthia, they were scared of becoming targets themselves. Then a voice interrupted the silence. "That's ridiculous." Heads turned instantly. A woman near the side wall crossed her arms tightly. Rachel Torres, early 30s, dark brown hair tied back messily, exhausted eyes. Single mother. Walter knew her only from brief mailbox conversations. Rachel looked directly at Cynthia. "My son watches those birds every morning before school," she said. "They're harmless." Cynthia's jaw tightened slightly. The HOA board already voted. Rachel frowned. "Really?" "Because my cousin checked public records this afternoon." The room grew very still. Rachel pulled folded papers from her purse. "There's no record of any board vote." Murmurs spread instantly. Cynthia interrupted sharply. "This meeting isn't up for debate." "No," Rachel replied, "but abuse of authority should be." The temperature inside the room seemed to change immediately. People shifted in chairs. Walter stared at Rachel in shock. Nobody ever challenged Cynthia publicly. Nobody. Cynthia's voice hardened. "Mr. Green will comply with neighbourhood standards." Walter looked around the room again. Still no eye contact. Still silence. Then Rachel spoke one more sentence. Quietly, but loudly enough for everyone to hear. You're bullying an old man because he feeds birds." The room exploded into whispers. Cynthia slammed her gavel loudly. Meeting adjourned. Walter barely slept that night. He kept replaying the meeting in his head. Rachel defending him, the silence from neighbours. Cynthia's cold expression. At 5:45 a.m, Walter finally gave up trying to sleep. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside carrying birdseed, then stopped dead. Every bird feeder was gone. The wooden poles had been ripped from the ground. One feeder lay smashed near the sidewalk. Birdseed covered the wet grass like spilled sand. Walter stared silently. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The feeders weren't expensive. That wasn't why it hurt. Helen painted one of them herself years ago. Tiny blue flowers covered the sides. Now it was shattered in pieces across the lawn. Walter slowly bent down. His hands trembled while picking up broken wood fragments. Then he heard footsteps running across the street. Oh my God! Rachel hurried toward him wearing sweatpants and carrying her phone. Her face turned furious instantly. Who did this? Walter swallowed hard. Kids, maybe. No, Rachel snapped. This was deliberate. She started taking pictures immediately. Walter kept staring at the broken blue flowers painted on the wood. Helen's flowers. Destroyed. Something inside him cracked quietly. Rachel noticed. Walter. He looked away quickly. I'm fine. But his voice betrayed him completely. By noon, Rachel had posted the photos online. Destroyed feeders. HOA letters. Walter standing alone beside the broken pieces. Her caption read, Our HOA is threatening a widower with legal action for feeding birds. Last night someone destroyed his property. The internet exploded. Thousands of shares within hours. Comments flooded non-stop. People were furious. Local Facebook groups spread the story first, then community pages, then local news stations started calling Rachel directly. By evening, reporters parked outside the Maple Glen entrance. Walter watched the news coverage from his recliner in disbelief. The headline read, HOA targets elderly resident over bird feeders. Walter felt sick. He hated attention, but the attention didn't stop. The next morning, strangers started arriving. One woman delivered handmade birdhouses. A veteran dropped off 3 giant bags of premium birdseed. Kids left handwritten cards in his mailbox. One card simply said, Birds make people happy. Walter nearly cried reading that one. For the first time since Helen died, the house felt less empty. But across the neighbourhood, Cynthia Holloway was furious. Friday afternoon, Walter opened his mailbox and found another letter. His stomach dropped immediately. Final compliance notice. The fine had reached $1,000. Walter's knees weakened slightly. Attached was a hearing notice demanding mandatory attendance. Failure to appear could result in further legal escalation. Walter sat heavily on the porch steps. $1,000. He physically could not afford that. Rachel arrived 20 minutes later carrying groceries. She immediately noticed his expression. What happened? Walter handed her the letter silently. Rachel read it once, then again slower. Oh, this woman is insane. Walter rubbed his forehead tiredly. Maybe I should stop. Rachel looked stunned. What? They're not going to stop pushing. So? Walter stared toward the empty feeder poles. I'm tired. Rachel softened slightly. For the first time since meeting him, Walter looked old, really old, not physically, emotionally, like someone slowly losing energy to keep fighting. Rachel sat beside him quietly. My husband left 2 years ago, she said suddenly. Walter glanced toward her. She rarely discussed personal things. He cleaned out our savings account before disappearing, she continued. I spent months terrified every time the phone rang. Walter listened silently. I stopped fighting people after that, Rachel admitted, because fighting is exhausting. She looked directly at him, but eventually I realised something. What? If difficult people learn they can scare you, they never stop. Walter looked away thoughtfully. Rachel stood. Don't give them your silence too. That night, Walter sat alone in the backyard, holding Helen's broken bird feeder. Moonlight reflected softly across the chipped blue paint. He remembered the afternoon she made it. Summer heat, country music playing softly from the garage radio, Helen laughing because she accidentally painted blue flowers on her own jeans. Walter smiled sadly. Then suddenly, a cardinal landed quietly on the fence nearby. Walter stared at it. The bird tilted its head slightly, watching him. Helen used to say cardinals appeared when people needed reminders they weren't alone. Walter always thought that sounded ridiculous. But tonight, the backyard didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Walter slowly stood, then walked inside. 5 minutes later, he returned carrying fresh wood, nails, and Helen's old paint supplies. If someone wanted a war over bird feeders, fine. Saturday morning shocked the entire neighborhood. Walter built 6 new feeders overnight. Not one. 6, and every single one sat clearly visible across his front yard. Bright colours, fresh paint, impossible to miss. Birds covered the lawn before sunrise ended. Cars slowed while driving past. Neighbours peeked through curtains again, but this time, some were smiling. At 8:12 a.m., Cynthia Holloway's black SUV stopped directly outside Walter's house. She stepped out holding a folder. Walter remained seated calmly on the porch. Cynthia marched across the lawn. You are intentionally violating HOA enforcement orders. Walter took a slow sip of coffee. Morning to you too. Cynthia's expression darkened. You think this is amusing? No, Walter replied quietly. I think it's sad. Cynthia glanced toward the feeders. You've turned this neighborhood into a circus. Walter looked around. Birds chirped loudly from nearby trees. Children across the street watched excitedly from a driveway. A few neighbours stood outside pretending not to stare. Looks more alive than usual to me. Cynthia stepped closer. You are creating legal liability for yourself. Walter looked directly into her eyes. For feeding birds? For refusing compliance? Walter noticed something then. She wasn't angry anymore. She was nervous, because the story had spread far beyond Maple Glen now. And she knew it. Walter leaned back slowly. You know what my wife used to say? Cynthia crossed her arms impatiently. She said people who obsess over controlling tiny things are usually miserable inside. Cynthia's face flushed red instantly. You should be very careful, Mr. Green. Then she turned and walked away quickly. Rachel, watching secretly from her porch, smiled. For the first time, Walter had pushed back, and the entire neighbourhood saw it happen. But things became far worse 2 nights later. At 1:17 a.m., Walter woke suddenly to shouting outside. Then glass shattered. Walter rushed toward the front window. Teenagers sprinted across his lawn, laughing wildly, while bird feeders swung violently from broken chains. One feeder burned on the grass. Burned! Walter froze in horror. Flames crawled across Helen's painted flowers, then headlights flashed suddenly. Rachel's car flew into the street. The teenagers panicked instantly and ran. Rachel jumped out holding her phone. Walter! Together, they stomped out the flames while neighbours turned on porch lights nearby. Walter's hands shook uncontrollably. Rachel stared at the burned feeder pieces. This has gone too far. Walter said nothing, because deep down, he finally understood something terrifying. This wasn't about birds anymore. The neighbourhood itself was unravelling. The emergency HOA hearing took place 3 days later, and nearly the entire neighbourhood showed up. News cameras crowded outside. Residents filled every chair. Some stood along walls holding small bird pins on their shirts. Others carried signs. Let him feed the birds. Stop ho abuse. We are your neighbours. Walter nearly turned around at the entrance. Rachel stopped him gently. No hiding today. Inside, Cynthia looked exhausted, but still arrogant. The meeting began immediately. Cynthia launched into a long speech about community standards, safety concerns, and resident harmony. Nobody listened. Finally, Rachel stood holding a thick binder. I requested public HOA records, she announced. Silence filled the room. Rachel opened the binder slowly. There was never a legal board vote against Walter Green. Murmurs spread instantly. Rachel continued. These fines were issued directly by Cynthia Holloway without board approval. The room erupted. One board member immediately stood. That's true, he admitted nervously. I never approved any wildlife enforcement. Cynthia looked horrified. You're violating confidentiality. No, another board member interrupted. You violated procedure. People started shouting. Then Rachel dropped the real bomb. And according to financial records, HOA funds were used last year to renovate Cynthia Holloway's private backyard. Complete silence. Then chaos. Residents exploded with anger. What? Are you serious? She stole HOA money. I knew something was wrong. Cynthia slammed the table furiously. That is completely misleading. Rachel held up printed invoices. $12,000. Gasps spread across the room. Walter sat frozen. Even he hadn't expected this. An older resident suddenly stood near the back. You terrorized this neighborhood for years, another voice shouted. You threatened. My daughter over chalk drawings. And fined me for medical equipment. People kept standing, one after another. Years of buried anger finally erupted, and at the center of it all sat Cynthia Holloway, losing control completely. Then something unexpected happened. Walter slowly stood up. The room quieted immediately. Even Cynthia stopped talking. Walter looked around carefully, at frightened neighbors, at angry residents, at reporters holding cameras. Then he spoke softly. You know what's sad? Silence. My wife loved this neighborhood. Walter swallowed hard. She used to say people here looked out for each other. His voice cracked slightly. But somewhere along the way, he glanced towards Cynthia. People became more worried about rules than kindness. Nobody moved. Walter continued quietly. I never wanted attention. I never wanted fights. He looked toward the crowd. I just didn't want the house to feel empty after Helen died. Several residents lowered their eyes. Walter took a slow breath. Those birds helped. Complete silence filled the room. Then an elderly woman near the front started crying quietly, and suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. This wasn't about HOA drama anymore. It was about loneliness, grief, control, humanity. Rachel wiped tears from her eyes, reporters lowered cameras slightly. Walter looked exhausted suddenly. So if feeding birds makes this neighborhood worse, he shrugged softly. Then maybe this place was already broken. Nobody spoke for several seconds, then applause. Started one person, then another, then the entire room stood. Thunderous applause filled the clubhouse. Cynthia sat frozen while the neighborhood rose against her completely, and for the first time in years, people stopped being afraid. 3 weeks later, Cynthia Holloway officially resigned. Multiple investigations followed. 2 additional board members stepped down. Voluntarily, the HOA bylaws were rewritten. Completely. Residents gained voting. Protections complaint procedures changed. Fines required. Transparency. But the biggest change wasn't written anywhere. People started talking to each other again. Kids played outside without nervous. Parents watching constantly. Neighbors. Shared food during weekends. Porches filled with laughter. Again. And all across Maple Glen. Bird feeders appeared. Dozens of them. Wooden feeders. Painted feeders. Hanging feeders shaped like little churches and cabins. Neighbour even built a massive community bird garden near the entrance sign, Walter. Became something unexpected, a symbol, not because he fought loudly, but because he finally stopped, surrendering quietly. One evening near sunset, Walter sat on his porch while birds fluttered across the glowing orange sky. Rachel and her son walked across the lawn carrying lemonade. Her son pointed excitedly toward the maple tree. Mr. Green! The cardinal came back. Walter smiled softly. The bright red bird perched peacefully on ear. Helen's rebuilt feeder. Walter stared quietly at it for a moment, then leaned back slowly in his chair. The neighborhood no longer felt silent anymore, and somehow Neither did the house.